the subgroup, with the help of others, we've curated some questions, but so we're going to do a panel discussion today with a series of questions, but then there'll be time at the end for Q&A.
But we would like, if this can be interactive, CARC People in our network is about the community. If you have some questions in the middle, if you'd like to put them in the chat, we can let Deb know, or she can watch. And if we have time, we can answer the questions as they come up. And if not, like we said, we have 30 minutes at the end, hopefully. Well, we can have a round of questions.
Cool. But while people are still trickling in, can everybody just kind of tell us kind of what you work on in the chat? Like, are you in the libraries? Are you part of an HPC center? Just so we get a sense of the audience here. Ooh, lots of HPC folks. Ooh, some library. Ooh, some InfoSec people.
And for our panelists, this group is a combination of all the CARC People Network groups. So we have systems facing, we have researcher facing, data facing, and then emerging centers. And so we invited all of our different communities to come to this one event. So that's who you'll see. These are mostly people that support researchers in one of those ways. So, and some obviously are researchers as well, but this is mostly, the audience would be mostly support for research.
I did go ahead and post the link to our website in the People Network. So you can dive into that to learn more.
Ooh, good audience today.
Yeah.
Nice.
And please remember that call document. I will repost that. Call document will have the notes. It does have the set of questions that we're going to be focusing on today as well. And it's a place for you to sign in. Let us know who you are, where you're from. And it also has our code of conduct is listed there as well.
Okay, I think it's slowing down. So let's introduce our panelists now. So if you guys could introduce yourself, what university you're from, and a bit about like what types of data your university deals with, like if you have a lot of PHI, for example. And first on my screen is Katrina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Katrina Biscay. I'm with the University of Cincinnati, and I'm the AVP for Information Security and CISO. It's my second stint back at UC after taking a little break with the state of Ohio, but I'm excited to be here. Thank you very much. We handle a lot of data. We don't have a ton of PHI, mostly PII, a lot of research data, a lot of intellectual property, a lot of regulated data, but really not that much PHI.
Great. Next is Vaughn.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to see some familiar faces and nice to meet some new folks. So I'm the AVP for Information Security here at Indiana University. I'm also director of a couple large NSF cybersecurity projects that support science, which I may mention through in terms of data here at IU, very large medical school, so a lot of medical data, smattering of DoD and other regulated data.
And Tom.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Hsu. I'm the CISO at Michigan State University. I've been here for almost 9 months. So prior to that, I was at Case Western Reserve University for about 14+ years. So, and a little fun history. I'm a researcher too. I'm a chemist, and I was a faculty back in the day, teaching general chemistry. And then, but I've also done, research in myself as well. So I take that perspective on what a researcher is doing. Generally building things from the ground up sometimes because no one's built what you need. That was me. And so sometimes when you try and put those things into square holes and it's a octagon, there may be ways to finagle it into security boxes, but the question is like, what are your risks? To follow what Katrina was mentioning, Michigan State, I'm still figuring out who's who, where, what. But in particular, we are building a hospital to be part of the research and education in the medical school and osteopathic medicine. We also have a lot of large animal veterinary stuff that I'm surprised to learn actually has DoD funding in some of those areas, which brings into the whole sense of whether the data is sensitive or not is actually going to be CUI, possibly. I'm on the forefront of that, right in the range to make sure that they don't over scope, because I think that would be a problem we need to pay attention to.
Cool. And last but not least, Sol.
Hi, I'm Salberman. I'm the CISO at the University of Michigan and also lead efforts in privacy, data governance, IT policy, and other duties as assigned. Look, we're big and we have just about everything minus a veterinary school. So we have all sorts of data of all sorts of kinds in our 19 schools and colleges and institutes and centers. We are the prototypical very large higher ed institution akin to Iowa, akin to Michigan State.
Cool. And just a note, you may have noticed that this is Midwest heavy. That is because our organizers are Midwest heavy, and we purposely chose CISOs at our own schools, just so we can also provide some context and experience ourselves. All right, now on to the questions. First one is for everybody. How do CISOs want to work with the research space, both research service providers and individual research projects? What has been successful and how can we work together? Let's go with Katrina first.
Sure. We want to be a true trusted partner and support the research mission. That is very important. We understand the need and we want to be part of it. I think a lot of CISOs in the past were traditionally commodity service focused, and then they approach the research field very much in the same way. Here's some policies, here's some technology, but we really don't want to be involved. Fortunately, I think that's shifting. And that's exciting. One of the best learning opportunities I think I've ever had was actually participating in an NSF grant proposal for a security project. Jane was actually a very close partner in that. But not only did that give me a crash course in the language, the process, the complexity of all the sponsored research, but it gave me a true opportunity to meet people on the research side that I've just not interacted with in the past. So we've developed very close relationships that last to this day. And I think that helps both sides feel comfortable in asking for support whenever that's needed. So that open and honest conversation is really a huge part of it.
Great, thank you. And Vaughn?
Yeah, thank you, Deb. So a little bit tongue in cheek, but what I would really like is for all the researchers on my campus to line up with the ones with the most risky research at the front, going to the least risky research at the back. Obviously that's a joke, but I mean, it gets at one of the real challenges that we have, that I don't even have my arms around all the research going on in campus. I mean, yeah, the large labs I know about, stuff that has export control I know about. If you've got CUI in your contract, I know about it, but that doesn't even start to cover everything else on campus I wish I knew about. So echoing Katrina's response, what I need to be is friendly and useful enough to the researchers that they're coming to me.
There's a great question in chat. Could you answer that real quick? What is risky exactly?
I think that's a great question. I suspect between Katrina, Saul, Tom, and I, we can easily spend the next 4 hours talking about that. Let's just say, I mean, the shortest answer is anything that if it happens, my university president is going to care about. Whether that's newspaper articles, fines, etc. Sorry, Katrina.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. What's going to put us in the news, what's going to cost us enrollment, and what's going to cost us research funding. Those are the big ones. I don't want to get that phone call. I don't think any of us do.
Great. All right. Now, Tom.
Well, tongue in cheek, I would always say I'd like to work with you over lunch, but that's obviously not the first thing you'd want to do. We're thinking about building relationships. And I think that's sort of removing the CISO mystique, which was we're the bad guy and we're just telling you can't do stuff. And the reality is you want to try and have some relationships where you understand what people are trying to do. I know there are many, many things that go on that run counter to what we've established for infrastructure in many modern universities. And even jumping into Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud platforms brings new challenges. So my goal would be to say is like, I understand this space really well. I don't understand your space very well, but let's see if we can find where those interfaces do occur. And that way I can speak your language and you can understand where I'm coming from. And the type of information you have to worry about actually isn't so much the sensitive information, it's the infrastructure. Vaughn and I were working on a project with Trusted CI about a ransomware attack that took out a science department here at Michigan State. Some sensitive data that really shouldn't have been there, but the other sensitive is they lost the ability to do the research. And that's a new boundary that hasn't really been discussed much. And I think we do need to have those conversations before they happen. So I think that's the platform for getting that. And we'll hope to maybe you can tell that story too, or learn from that story, what happened in Michigan State.
Ansel.
So you've heard, I think, pieces that create the whole of we need to be trusted, available, meet researchers where they are, understand, if not their research, the research mission of the institution. You know, to Katrina's point, if you think you're going to be a CISO or a successful CISO at a R1 in particular, but really any college or university that does research, thinking that you're only trying to protect your ERP system and your network is not the way to go. And honestly, I came back to higher ed because of students and researchers. I mean, it's maddening, but it's fun. And being around brilliant researchers, supporting them in their research mission, both to enable it by appropriately securing it or keep it compliant. And you already heard about research partnerships themselves. So I pride myself at Michigan to where I find opportunities to actually engage in the research and the teaching mission of the university. It keeps you grounded and it keeps you knowledgeable about the place you're in. So I almost tongue-in-cheek started when people are listing what they did, what slice of the university they're in. I just want to remind everybody, we're all part of higher ed. We're all part of a university, and to slice and dice you to, I run infrastructure, I do security, I do HPC, I do other sorts of advanced research computing, is creating the silos that we all need to be better at breaking down. And just remembering, whatever our school motto, logo, whatever you want to sort of associate with it, that we're all here to serve a common mission. And a big chunk of that, at University of Michigan, over $1 billion chunk of that is research. So.
Great, thank you all. That was a great way to start this off. Next question is specifically directed at Katrina. How can the research space help security teams better understand the goals of research?
Again, it comes back to talking. Communication is key. Please talk to us. Tell us about your project. Tell us about the goals. What technology you might be using. What are you worried about? I mean, we've had situations where maybe some controls weren't put in place and the research was stolen. So that security really begins at the very start of the project, because it may not be necessary to secure it at initial, according to the researcher, but in reality, all of that data leads to a result that they're very proud of and it's important to them. So it's better if we start earlier, but we really do want to help. Most of the time, we don't even know the project is happening. Frequently, we only get engaged if there's a technology control plan to sign off on, or if there's a particular security clause that's in the grant. But we can relieve some of that burden on the PIs if we have the conversations. I think it's also important for the Office of Research and the Office of Information Security to have a really close ongoing partnership. There's a significant crossover in our responsibilities. What we've done at UC is that we have a regular touch point between InfoSec, research computing, research IT, high performance, and research security in the compliance office. We have regular conversations. Topics are brought to the table very early on before they become problems. And it also gives us an opportunity to learn from each other and come up with mutually acceptable solutions that don't compromise security, don't increase our risks, and don't stop the researchers from doing what they need to do.
All right, next question is for anyone to jump in. I saw a great article recently that was kind of directed at tech companies, and it says, hey, tech companies, universities cover all the verticals. I just thought that was brilliant. So for you all, as the person in charge of securing all of these verticals, like how do you balance all these different business needs, or how would you ideally balance them if you had the resources?
I'll take a swing at that first. When we say cover all the verticals, I think that also includes power and water and all the other infrastructure that's around the environment. I think researchers sometimes see those as utilities, and but who has redundant utility pathways? I think you should make sure you have a good way to prioritize all those particular services. And I guess the more the question is, how do you cover them all? You have to have some thicker peanut butter on some parts of the bread and some thinner parts. And you have to know where those risks will be taken. And I think that's the key piece that you need to make sure you know as a researcher, that some things, sometimes you won't be the priority. The top priority, I should say. You're still a priority. We love you guys, but not always the top.
So I'll jump in and just, it's not my job to secure the University of Michigan. I help enable security. But you know whose job it is? If anybody's on from University of Michigan, it's your job. I mean, there's trite sayings about security being a shared responsibility, and it is. We can't. So whether the verticals include, a finance sector, yep, we have that. Tom mentioned, our SCADA systems and our industrial systems. Yes, we have all of those things, but all of those are also run or partly run by other people, and they have to do their part. So, we hopefully prioritize according to risk, according to what we're seeing in our environment, according to what we're hearing from our peers. We can't be everywhere doing everything, so we have to rely on others to do it. And I can't stress that enough. But I feel like, the next tattoo is the security is that shared responsibility, because we can't secure everything. And we certainly can't secure everything in the way we imagine we'd like it to do. And frankly, we shouldn't, because that'd be a waste of money. And it also started impeding things. You've heard from a variety of my co-panelists that, putting the hammer down to everything in the equal way is just going to be, it's ineffective. We'll never, it's going to be overly costly, and it'll inhibit the mission of the university. So do your part, people.
I'll pick up there on what Saul was saying, to add some examples to what Tom and Saul gave in terms of university verticals. They also include things like the football game behind Saul, our public access libraries, the dorms, my school of music, right? Places that we don't think of as being terribly IT heavy. And so to Saul's point, right? No one is served well by us applying the same security across all of those different things. Analogy that I've heard many times now, right? Universities really are more like cities than organizations. And so the number one thing we have to have is that flexibility to handle things differently. In my ideal world, if resources were no limit, I would literally have different cybersecurity programs for the dorms, for the football stadium, for the music school, for the DoD research labs. Now, obviously, resource constraint makes that impossible. So I've got to have common services that I spread across both around all these things, and then try to figure out how to appropriately adapt them for each.
Completely agree with Vaughn and the panelists. There is a lot. Right now, we have a public safety project, 911, that takes priority over most things because of the life safety implications. But it's layers. That's really the approach. You know, depending on the risk of a particular environment, that's how many layers of security do we apply to that. But we do absolutely need help from the community. The environments are distributed in a lot of cases. So enterprise security can't do it all.
Great, those are all fabulous points. All right, so a bit of security education for the audience. So one concept that security folks like to talk about is this CIA triad, which stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So ideally you can have all three, but often they conflict with each other and you have to prioritize them. So this question is mainly for Tom and Saul. How do you approach this triad with respect to research, either balancing it or even defining it?
I'll let Saul go first, since he's always been following me.
So it depends on the research. I mean, I can tell you what usually languishes in the research space, and that's often availability because it's an afterthought for many researchers. And I think, you know, Tom, you probably can tell a little story about the incident that you had at Michigan State that falls along those lines. But it's, again, it's often an afterthought, and particularly for those researchers who are perhaps using their own systems, maybe not thinking about, I don't know, backups or alternative power sources and things like that. Confidentiality, again, depends on the research. Sometimes that's huge when we're thinking about human subjects in particular, or about research that is, you know, a particular funding agency or a granting agency has some, you know, very high restrictions on who can see the data. So confidentiality could be high on the list. Integrity is always important, right? I mean, you want your research to be true. So where those falls, again, depends on the researcher. I would say the spot I see the most challenge in is that availability, because it's not just researchers that think of it as an afterthought. We often don't pay enough attention to many systems from an availability perspective.
Yeah, sort of follow up on that. Whenever I hear this type of conversation about the CIA triad, I'm reminded of the story of faster, better, cheaper. You can have any two. Just pick the two you want. And I think sometimes we have been focused on confidentiality for so long, because that's where security was born out of. You know, this is a new field as a CISO. I mean, I say new because it's less than 20 years old. So in another 10 years, it'll be an established field, right? But we focused on confidentiality. Universities did that. Part of the recommendations I always recommended was like, if you want to not have to avoid over securing your environment, I say that in jest almost, that can you make sure that your information has not got the confidentiality levels that we care about? Basic research. You're free to try and do what you want. But I think it means that confidentiality still sits high on the risk register for an organization like a research university, but you need to start thinking about availability. And because sometimes people don't realize what part of the information and the information systems they have, they're really dependent upon. So it's valuable to have a risk perspective. So you can know I can take hits on some of the areas. So I would assume now that we are going to start to be focused on availability and less on the confidentiality. So the next 10 years, maybe. That's my prediction. Buy stock?
Great. And another one for Sol. What advice would you give for crafting budgets or funding proposals to send to leadership to help provide secure services and incentivizing researchers to use them, for example, by trying to get the fees low?
So this is going to be I don't know, potentially a controversial statement, or at least an out of the box statement. I don't think that advanced research computing, high performance computing should be fee-based. We're all doing big data research. We're all using a lot of cores. I pick on art history because I have a passion for it. There are art historians that need HPC resources, just as there are medical researchers that need them, just as there are chemists, and that everybody has to get charged for this incents a couple things. One, it incents them to build their own because they can build it into the overhead of their proposal. And the other is it creates bad systems. So in my fantasy world, this, advanced research computing would be more of a common commodity. And at Michigan, we are starting to nudge away from that a little bit, and put up a basic computing package together that it serves about 80% of our research population, that they don't have to worry about building their own. That said, that it is still often fee-based. And so we are trying to build more systems that are widely available for our researchers, so they don't have to build their own, and they're cost effective. And the advantages are, one, you get the security built in, you get the compliance built in, you get a lot of overhead from a researcher perspective that is removed from you because you don't have to worry about building and sustaining. I think we still need to educate our researchers when we build these systems about why they're cost effective. When you think about a bottom line, I'm buying it once and then I'm done, versus, yep, I'm paying year over year. What you often leave behind is the people cost and keeping it up, the potential for something to go wrong, and then a big cleanup afterwards.
I remember some early NSF grants that I'd seen where the researchers had built the system, and then the grant, it was a contract. It ended after 5 years, but they're still on the hook to maintain the data and make it available because it was an NSF grant. And they came to IT and said, help. And in a sense, without a funding channel, it had to become a community resource to store the data, to make it available for future researchers. And I think that sometimes we suffer from not thinking long-term enough. We think to the end of our proposal till the next proposal comes along, and maybe I can keep those postdocs on the new grant. That sometimes we think about the people resources, but I think now it's become apparent that researchers do need to think about where their data is going to reside long after that particular research effort's over, especially if they're required by the first part of the grant to maintain it on their own cost. That means the university is going to bear that somehow.
And honestly, I'd rather researchers spent their time and efforts towards their research, not maintaining an IT environment where it could be better sustained somewhere else.
Yeah, so if I could summarize this a bit, it sounds like you should just convince your leadership that letting researchers do it themselves is ultimately more expensive than building some sort of central resource. Is that about right?
It's close, and it's a big wide world of researchers out there. So I realize this is not everything under one pot to make the meal. But to the extent that there's a number of commonalities amongst needs, surely we can consolidate those better and have more sustainable models for funding and support.
Yeah, and just so you know, I think you're preaching to the choir. Everybody's just trying to figure out how to do it when leadership doesn't give them money. Speaking of which, budgets and funding are a finite resource, but researchers still need services So when you do have these limited resources to build research services, what security controls or standards should be prioritized?
I'll start. Training is cheap, and people don't do it because it's cheap. They think they need to invest in something. They should do the training. Some of the things that hit us were just not being aware of what they need to do in the IT world, patching, updating, knowing when there's vulnerable services. That's the first step, I think. Training and knowing what to do. The second piece, I'll leave for my colleagues to throw out.
I would say foundational controls. So we already do a lot of things just for enterprise security. You know, we have multi-factor available, we have vulnerability scanning, we have centralized logging, making those available to the researchers a la carte, depending on their project and their needs. Extend that, empower the research IT or the local IT to help you. You know, they can run the vulnerability scans. You don't have to do it as central security necessarily. Yes, you can keep track of it as just as your university asset, but they can really assist you in pushing that security out to the projects.
I'll echo Tom and Katrina here a little bit and say, philosophically, I think we tend to reach for technologies a little too quickly to solve a lot of these problems. And I've always been, and I know I'm preaching to a choir here, been a big believer in facilitation and outreach. You know, training is part of that, but you know, having security staff that can go out and work directly with researchers and build the relationships, because technology cannot replace those relationships, and just everything is so much easier with them. So like Katrina was saying, I think there are some real core pieces of technology that have proven themselves over time that we just absolutely need, and things get added to those slowly. Like, you know, two-factor is now becoming pretty standard part of our stacks. But I think we really do need to keep the people in mind here when we're thinking of services.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. You bring up an excellent point. One of the things our Office of Research actually just did, they justified and hired a cybersecurity person that is in the Office of Research, but is a liaison to the Office of Information Security. They deal with the PIs on daily basis. They're the interface. They have those relationships that they're developing, but they have enough security knowledge in their background to be able to speak the security language on our side and communicate the needs a lot more clearly. That's so far, it's early on. It's only been a few weeks, but even in those couple of weeks, it's already been successful.
Katrina, I'll just mention we have something similar here at IU. We've actually branded it the Secure My Research Service. So if you Google for that, you'll find that it's just finishing its first year, and it's been very successful in terms of the number of PIs we've gotten to voluntarily come to it. And we help out with everything like contract negotiation. I mean, one of our key goals is to negotiate security controls out of contracts when they're not needed. And that's always been a huge win.
Cool, and I'd just like to throw in a little bit, since Katrina mentioned security language, there's actually an online course that's geared specifically towards people who need to be conversant in security from an organization called SANS. There's a SANS 301 course. I took that, and that is where I got all these words I'm using to educate people. So highly recommend it if you need to work closely with security personnel, which is pretty much everyone. Cool. And speaking more of, oops.
If I may, I'd like to add, you know, Katrina and Vaughn mentioned multi-factor. Actually, there's something more core to that, is getting services you're using to use your centralized authentication service. But those are further up in the stack. I've run into many projects that had an out-of-band solution that was, you know, casually addressed, and that's how they got hit. So don't lose sight of the weak points in your infrastructure. And sometimes as researchers who have to take, you know, have to be out there making the tall path in the tall grass, as we call it sometimes. But if they can rely on some of the infrastructure that's got these things built up, you're going to make your way faster.
Okay, we've kind of already touched on this a bit, but let's move on to shared responsibility models more. Like it's a huge thing in the cloud providers to come up with shared responsibility models, but I feel it's useful for pretty much any service you run. It's all just like assigning which team is responsible for which layers of security controls. So like in the cloud, it is generally the cloud provider versus the end user. When you're using a university to facilitate it, it will be like cloud provider, your university cloud team, and then the researchers. So just generally speaking, how do you think this model should be divided among the enterprise IT, research IT, and the researchers?
I think we're all agreed that it's definitely applicable to on-prem services, not just cloud. But I think that separation is really dependent on the nature of your environment. So some universities are incredibly distributed. They have multiple IT units. Their IT personnel in the colleges reports to the deans, perhaps, and not the CIO. And others are very centralized. So in a centralized organization, the bulk is obviously going to fall on that enterprise IT, with maybe things like administrative controls of physical security on the PIs or the Office of Research. But in more distributed environments, that's delineation is more complex. Maybe enterprise will handle network security, but the endpoint falls on the college IT or research IT. So it's really important to customize that responsibility model when you create it to your institution. You can perform an initial assessment, but by using one of the standard frameworks, NIST 800-171 is the one that everybody loves, or 53, for instance. Those lay out the required controls very well. And as you go through that assessment, you really identify, well, who currently handles that area? Is it central? Is it distributed? Is it the Office of Research? And then that gives you an opportunity to then evaluate, is this really the optimal way of doing things, given the level of risks you're willing to accept? Maybe this is an opportunity to shift something and alleviate the burden on the Office of Research or the researchers themselves. And then, consider documenting it, even as a formal SLA, to identify those responsibilities.
Did you have a thought on that, Vaughn?
Little bit of a higher level philosophical take, perhaps. I mean, one of the things that comes about, we talked about risk a little bit earlier, is, of course, everybody's view of risk is a little bit different. To the researcher, their biggest risk is not getting their research done or not getting their grant funded. To the AVP of Information Security, right, it's a breach. To the president, it's the front page of the paper. One thing I tend to do is look, whenever I see alignment between somebody's view of the risk and the risks involved, right, I don't worry as much about that as where I see the misalignment, right? It's the researcher handling the data who may care less about the confidentiality of the data than getting the research done. And that's where you tend to see the issues, and you've got to work a little bit more on the responsibilities.
Wow, and that's a perfect segue. Whoops.
Well, let me add, I think this is a really good question that requires a lot of introspection, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do as a new CISO in a new, in an organization, is to figure out where those boundaries are between executive leadership, senior leadership, and IT leadership on who's responsible for what. And that's actually not as easy as it sounds. I could come in and say, like, I'm responsible for all this and you're responsible for that. Well, there could be different capabilities in each department, especially in the decentralized model, which we have here at Michigan State. So one group might be just fine. The other ones, I could look at you like, you shouldn't be doing any of this. This is not where you're not in your wheelhouse. You're struggling just to do the basics. Let us do those things for you. So I think there's going to be a give and take and negotiation capability there, but I have to be careful not to overextend my teams. Because we're not significantly staffed to do everything at the university because we're not totally centralized. But I think from a research perspective, a researcher and a PI is going to have to know where the particular risks are and what they can handle. So I say it's a variable until you figure out, at least for me, until I figure out where the best center of mass is, or what they call it on a sail when you're sailing a sailboat, the force point. And that's where you get your most wing power in the sense of what you can do. So ideally, so we're not working against each other is where I think the responsibility balance sets.
Cool. Yeah, and this is all a great segue into my next bit. I wanted to give a little crash course in risk since that word comes up. And it's a very algorithmic thing in cybersecurity, talking about risk. For example, so I'm Michigan Medicine, the academic medical center at University of Michigan. So I actually have another med-specific CISO who has some of his own programs. He's got like 7 categories of risk that he is worried about. So there's the obvious ones like financial, institutional reputation. And since we have a hospital, there's patient safety. But one of the risks is research productivity. That is a defined risk that he actually cares about, which is awesome. But kind of more about risk is you always have some risk. Like if you have no risk, the only way to accomplish that is to like throw your laptop into the ocean. So that's not workable. So what you have to do is manage your risk. So you need to assess it, which is quantify it, and have a decision or strategy around it. And so one thing that we run across a lot is the assessors. They're just there to describe the risk. That's all they're there for. And that's all they're empowered to do. But the CISO, they get to set risk strategy and can also decide how to handle individual risks. So for example, if a mitigation that the assessors come up with would be exceptionally burdensome for a project, the CISO can accept that risk without mitigation. That is their prerogative. So that was a nice little crash course. Now the actual question. So how do you all as CISOs make decisions about risk acceptance, particularly in the research space?
So Deb, I'm going to disagree with you here.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, it's the business that accepts the risk, not the CISO. The CISO helps inform the decision. It's our job to educate the executive leadership on the level of risk, the potential impact to the institution. But ultimately, we're not in the business of security of technology. We're in the business of education of research, and that takes priority. So sometimes these risk decisions will be made that I, as a CISO, may disagree with. But then it's my responsibility and my team's responsibility to partner with the stakeholders and get creative. If we can't mitigate the risk, if we can't accept the risk, we're going to try to reduce it.
I just want to second Katrina there entirely. And the challenge is that tends to be rather messy conversations because, you know, I would love it if my leadership would tell me we want our risk tolerance to be an 83, right? But instead, what it is it's a collection of decisions over time that sort of sets a culture of risk tolerance. And a lot of what the CISO is trying to do is translate what they feel is that business tolerance for risk into individual technical and other decisions, right? And they're constantly having to juggle that. They're making those decisions, not in an island, but I mean, in consultation with the CIO, perhaps other VPs, oftentimes the general counsel, right? So it just very much Katrina hit it on the nose.
Yeah, I would refine that a little bit. Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
So I know where Deb's coming from, and Deb, there's some behind the curtain stuff that you might not have as much visibility of how the sort of voodoo that Jack does.
Okay.
So on the Michigan medicine side, it's a very structured environment, and Debbie, perhaps you can attest to that. More so than most, what I'll just say, campus environments are. And my partner, Jack Kufal, who's the CISO for Michigan Medicine, has done an amazing job setting up what I'll just call a risk analysis infrastructure. So while it may appear sometimes on the surface that he's making decisions, he's making them in two ways. One, he has helped set boundaries that have given him some approval or permissions to say, business owners have agreed that I'm empowered to make risk-based decisions in this space using this criteria. And so while it appears he's very autonomous, he is, but he's set up a structure around it. A lot of other things actually come back to it. He has an oversight group that has business owners. I'm on it as well. And he's like, he just does what Katrina and Von and probably Tom were just about to describe. He's described the risk. He makes a recommendation on it, but it says it's up to you. And there's been times where there's been significant disagreements on both sides, where it's like, I don't think we should accept the risk, says Jack, and it gets accepted, or I think we should accept the risk and say, no, we don't want to. So just know that there's behind the scenes stuff that it's not that Jack doesn't have authority, but he has set good structures up to allow for ease of risk-based decision making. Where on the campus side, it's often a lot messier.
Thanks, all. And I was thinking one of the places where the CISO does need to throw his or her body in front of a locomotive is in the sense that someone is taking a risk that's not in concert with the overall risk picture for the organization. And that, again, if you had the relationships, you can call somebody like, hey, you don't want to do this, and because you're going to get a bigger problem for us all. But sometimes you have to let it happen so that people learn it. Because, I mean, we are not in a controlled society where we can actually say everything is the way it's supposed to be, because, gosh, that's a huge burden on you to know everything. You can't. And you'll end up with no hair like me by trying to solve those problems. So there are times when you do need to jump in, but I agree that it is a business decision, but oftentimes you're seen as the enforcer of those. It's mostly because you're letting people know, hey, you're outside the bounds of what we decided. Now make sure you get some support or some contingencies. That's what I think sometimes we forget about risk. Everybody thinks everything has to be mitigated, and it doesn't.
To point out, there's a comment by Lydia in the chat that talks about documentation of the acceptance of risk. I think that is really, really important. Make sure that the documentation is in place and all of the stakeholders are informed of it.
One observation I would make at IU here, at least, I think we're much better at talking about IT risk around servers and hardware and equipment, and we're still really learning how to do it around data.
Yeah, so that's probably the difference, because medical science is all about data.
Yeah, particularly non-PHI data, right? I mean, I think if it falls under HIPAA or CUI or something, right, there's a compliance program. Everything else gets challenging.
Cool. All right, and here's the question I bet everyone is waiting for. CMMC. This one's directed at Tom. How should universities even begin thinking about meeting CMC?
Well, let me throw back a little bit. A couple of us at EDUCAUSE were really working on the NIST 800-171 and how universities can use them. It was a slimmed down version of the 853, which is like 170 pages worth of controls. And when I go back to my previous statement, you don't have to apply every control. That doesn't necessarily mean you do your risk. So what you're dealing with is the part of the federal governments that are doing, the DoD in particular, put it in their acquisition requirements that you have to meet some level of certification. And my answer to that is it's coming. They actually do make sense. You got to manage your scope. If some contract says your whole university needs to be there, you're like, no, wait a minute, let's talk. Because the music department, unless they're running I think of the IU School of Music, right? they're going to say you can only use the second valve once every third note or every third, that's the kind of level of detail that you wouldn't necessarily be able to use. Maybe that's a bad analogy. I'm good at bad analogies, by the way. The point was, what level of control does that contract DoD sponsor really want to know? They want to know whether you're going to blow a hole in all their data. The second part about scope management is they have a tendency to call everything the controlled unclassified information, which means it's their data and they're telling you what security controls you have to do around it. So you want to be careful. And universities are working their ways to build environments where a researcher who has those requirements under the contract can just put their data there and work on it. Is that going to work totally? Maybe. It depends on what the projects are. If it's HPCC, you're not going to go build another environment just to do DoD information, but you might be able to add some of the controls. So the certification piece is actually, as researchers, we all need to know that's going to cost. It's not normally what your security team can come do an assessment for, let alone attest to all those controls. And then the CISO or some official at university has to go and attest that those controls have been assessed. And then third-party assessments. So think PCI for all your research. You always had to have somebody certify that those controls are there. And you and I know that people are people, and they will start circumventing those controls if it's in the way of their progress. So we got to find a way to make sure that people understand what it is. Certification is a lot more than just having a security plan. Did that answer the question?
I don't know, audience. Any more questions about CMMC? I don't think that was the answer you were hoping for.
Well, look, don't panic, but prepare. And prepare is not all on you. It's working with your security team, with your Office of Research, and with your General Counsel's office. I think Tom hit the high notes, which is, can we avoid scope creeps? Can we create, again, what I'll just call commodity or widely available systems specifically for CMMC purposes? Because otherwise the cost, I won't even talk about the security piece, the potential cost for multiple assessments by a third party would be madness. But most of all, don't panic. I mean, CMMC has been looming like the guillotine for years at this point, and it's still not quite there. So I'd hate for those of you in the research computing space, don't start building stuff without talking to your partners and really planning for it.
And I'll add one thing to that. As Saul pointed out, CMMC is still coming, and it's had a few thrashes already. I think we're still in a phase where we can be talking with our federal relations folks, because back to Tom's point, its biggest danger is the federal government doesn't understand we're not all Raytheons, right? These homogeneous organizations. And back to the conversation about verticals, if CMMC comes down and says all of Indiana University has to be at level 3, right? Forget it. I'm packing up my bag and going home. It's a good time to retire, right? But if I have to get my sporting events up to CMMC level 1 and my DoD research up to CMMC level 3, this is a great use of my resources, right? So a lot will be in how this actually hits us, how the actual auditors audit it. And so I think we're still in a phase, if you have a chance to talk to your federal relations people about getting the DoD and others to clarify the scope, treat the universities like the heterogeneous organizations that we are, we will all thank ourselves 5 years from now.
So let me pile on what Von is saying with even more force. I imagine Von and Tom, I know you have been involved in stuff, and Katrina, I imagine you have, as I have. I've been involved with our government relations people. A lot of the security folks are. I think a voice that often isn't heard loud enough, and I'm not going to stereotype you all as, sort of computer wonks and nerds, but those people in the research computing space, you've got to get a voice. It can't just be your VP. Now, it should be maybe perhaps channeled through your VP of research, but you've got to be vocal here too. I don't want the security folks, I mean, it's an irony that the security folks are saying, we don't want all this security stuff because it doesn't make sense. You should likewise be saying, we don't want all this security stuff because it paints too broad a brush. We can't sustain it under our current models, and do better. So please get a voice in this as well, because sometimes I feel like we are shouting from a security space into the wilderness alone, or perhaps too alone. Come join the chorus, please.
And it actually makes me think of rolling back to the point when you had the question about what researchers could do, you know, and we said education, and we all started to chime in on things that we could use that are part of our decision to build for our infrastructure. And it could pose a question that, did a number of universities want to actually adopt a CMMC type of framework and then have various levels within the university? So that, one, to me, I like to have an engine. I like to have a process that does this. And then we can just add people in and make it adapt for new conditions. So you know, getting on a conveyor belt, so to speak. And if I can build a conveyor belt where this works, a business process that does those, then I'm not doing 5 different types of security programs. I could do one that has different levels of intensity. I'll find an analogy on that sometime.
No, that's exactly it. There's a significant amount of overlap between CMMC level 3 and, just as Sol said earlier, NIST 853 and 171. So if you're already working on 171 for other compliance efforts like GLBA, for instance, you are doing a lot of the same things. So automating and combining as much as possible is really a good idea, and selling that as an institutional effort in some cases. Yes, the funding will come from different areas depending on the level of security necessary, but there's a lot of commonality amongst all of the controls and requirements.
You know, one thing to remember is a researcher, when you write a grant proposal or a research contract, it is a contract. There are pieces that you can say, hey, you want that? I will need to update my cost figures because we don't have some of this infrastructure. On the other side, it means a researcher who's competing for you with that, who has that CMMC capability, could maybe undercut you. But you know, it's not just about price. Obviously, it's about the level and depth of your expertise and your ability to find answers with the funding. So keep that in mind. Not every control has to be there. It's a certification that it meets some of the standard. Remember, the government is pretty far away from this information to make a decision. They just want to know, is it certified or not? And we have to remember that the research has to be valid and useful. So, you know, this is we don't want the tail to wag the dog on us.
Okay, switching to a different data type, HIPAA. We also get a lot of questions around HIPAA. Can you boil down kind of the policies and standards around HIPAA into a few bite-sized concepts, such as encrypt everything?
Don't do research in your clinical space.
You know, the main thing about HIPAA that, I mean, I actually like it in some ways, which is HIPAA gets enforced if you have a breach and the Office of Civil Rights comes and finds you weren't doing enough security. That's sort of honestly the way things are sort of written. And then there's been some case law that has been built up over, well, not case law here, but examples that have been built up over time on what that actually means. And the main thing to take away is you better have been paying attention to security. And so different organizations may translate that a little differently. It's very different than something like 1071. You know, Tom just said it's blah pages of controls. HIPAA really just is, we need to feel you took the security when we come. So you better have a plan. Here at IU, we interpret that as, you know, having an annual risk assessment to make sure that plan's up to date. Some things now, just like we talked about earlier, some services are foundational. You know, things like encryption at rest of laptops is pretty foundational. This is still one of the biggest problems I see here, the lost laptop in a car that wasn't encrypted. That's a breach, right? So it's not always about malicious security entities. It's just, you know, preventing that getting out. So then it's those foundational things. So encryption tends to come up a lot. That's because people lose laptops a lot. Then it's just, some of the basic controls.
Yeah, HIPAA's not magic. It's mostly just good security practices broken down into administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. But for the research space, one thing I really, really want to emphasize for you all is please work with your Office of Research, your General Counsel's office, even your security office, to disambiguate when something's HIPAA and when something's not. Medical information doesn't have to be HIPAA, or health information doesn't have to be HIPAA, I should say. It doesn't mean you shouldn't protect it well, but just do know that there are some oddities, and I think a good example is actually how I think all or most of our institutions are approaching getting back to school and vaccines. If I am self-reporting my vaccine information, that is not HIPAA data. It might be health and medical information, but I'm providing it. We might want to secure it in much the same way, but it ain't the same thing. So some of that disambiguation to understand from both compliance and reporting and even fine purposes, what's HIPAA and what's not, is really important for you all, because you're the IT engine or custodian of this stuff, but you're not going to always intricately know the data. So don't be afraid to reach out, and don't always believe what the researcher tells you. Sometimes you need to get a check with your Office of Research, with your compliance office, with your General Counsel's office.
Ooh, yes, people don't always understand what HIPAA data is. We just had a big project like this. It's the main differentiation is who is actually inputting the data. It's HIPAA when it's a healthcare provider.
Right, it's a covered entity. And I think something for everybody in this research group needs to know, the HITECH Act, which modified HIPAA, the final rules came out in it took a couple of years to do the final rule. There was interim final rules, and there's a big debate. A number of us who were involved in that were making sure that they excluded research information from the HIPAA coverage. But you still have to work with somebody who's a covered entity, typically your research hospital or your hospital, where they're providing clinical care. And you have to be sure that if you're handling it in accordance with what their needs are. So meaning you don't have to have a whole HIPAA program around research data. But if it's medical information, as Saul mentioned, it's still the same information, just under another hat. Maybe you turned it from research, but research is excluded in the HITECH Act, especially from the fines and penalties. But it doesn't mean that you can just disclose it. It's the key piece to understand where those gradations are. And I think that's important to know. You don't have to do it if you're in a research scenario, but if you're in a clinical space and you're doing research, then you probably do. House rules, if you want to call it that.
Cool. And another new frontier. What are your biggest concerns about research computing in the cloud?
I would say that researchers using cloud workloads without support. AWS, Azure, you name it, they have so many options. There's so many security controls. There's so many just different things you can do with your project. And most people are just not as familiar with those controls if they don't work with them on a daily basis. So there may not be as visibility or logging that's available to facilitate incident response in the case of a malicious incident. There's just a lot to the cloud anymore. That availability and performance is, of course, is attractive to researchers. There are some things that are only available in AWS that we can't cost effectively implement inside a university. But we definitely need to provide some proper security guardrails to make sure that we don't get in trouble. So, I mean, I think everybody's heard about unsecure AWS S3 buckets or security keys posted to GitHub, anything like that. So I would say any kind of support that we can provide to researchers to facilitate the mobility of their workloads to the cloud would be very important. And that's what I worry about the most.
I would just say, Deb, it makes me miss closet clusters. At least if you had IT hidden in a closet, I had a chance of seeing attacks on my network. Now, if you get infrastructure in the cloud and you put it on a personal credit card, I've got no way of knowing your data is even there or even having a chance of protecting it.
Yeah, well, I don't want closet clusters. The use of the cloud outside of a supported or at least contracted for environment, I don't like. And it's, as Vaughn said, it's a credit card away, or sometimes it's free.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good risk. And the ascension is, do we have our teams built up to understand how to solve those problems in that new space? Some schools that have been very cloud heavy would have done that. Other universities and other departments who don't use things like AWS and the control tower and the landing zone platforms, that infrastructure, as Katrina alluded to, if it's there, then the researcher doesn't have to figure it out. But if everybody's spinning one up on their own, it complicates our problem to help solve it, because they could be configured, they could not be configured, and we need to know. So I think the unknown is the big risk here. So we get knowledge.
All right, and last question directed towards Vaughn for shameless plugging. What are national resources to help with information security for research?
Well, let me start generally, and then I'll get to the shameless plugging. So the National Science Foundation really does, care about the cybersecurity of the research it funds. It funds about $8 billion worth of research every year across the US. And so they've got, out of the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure, they have it's the CICI program. That's Cybersecurity Innovation for Cyber Infrastructure. This comes out once a year, and it's a very practical program you can write a grant to for doing security of scientific workflows. And so if you run into these challenges and you've got some grant writing expertise, or you can find a grant writer, that usually comes out around September every year. So it'll probably emerge next year. And it's funded a number of great things. One thing I'll mention is Carolyn Ellis, used to be at Purdue, who's now out at UCSD, is starting a community of practice on, I think it's around CUI, but other regulated data, building off of a CICI grant she's got. To the shameless plugging part, a couple other things that CICI funds. One is an NSF Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or Trusted CI. We try to offer all sorts of advice and training in cybersecurity tailored for scientists and researchers. I've dropped the link in the notes document. And then the other one is ResearchSOC, or Research Security Operations Center, where we are providing operational cybersecurity services for larger research infrastructure. Started, base funded by NSF, and then it's going to be a fee model on top of that. But it's tailored for research, unlike commercial offerings. So thank you, Deb, for that opportunity.
Cool. And now for audience questions. Jane and Justin, have we managed to answer everything that's been in the chat so far?
Oh my gosh, it's hard enough to keep up with the notes, Deb, to know if all questions have been answered. I think that the community's been answering them to some degree. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if somebody has a question that maybe they didn't get answered and would like to just bring it up, just go ahead and speak up. It's probably the easiest way. Or pop it down at the bottom again.
Yeah, or repost it into the chat. Yeah, that would be helpful for us.
And for our Canadian friends, there's Canary as well, CANARIE. That's like the REN ISAC for Canada.
Yeah, and somebody just mentioned, Scott just mentioned CANSOC, which is a security operations center that our colleagues up north have started as well.
I see one where Scott Dellinger asked Cloud and VM, who is sysadminning and how is it being overseen? I guess that's at different universities. I know at UC we're still working on that.
Yeah, that's especially a problem where it's infrastructure as a service rather than the proper commercial cloud. If you're just getting a bare VM and then a grad student is the sysadmin, you're in for a world of hurt.
We're in the process of tackling that at the university right now. It's been a challenge because a lot of the times we don't have the visibility into what folks are doing and we don't know what projects may require it. So any input from the Office of Research that says, hey, this researcher is interested in working on cloud, it gives us a use case. It gives us something to test. It gives us something to work with. And I know Jane's been incredibly helpful with that for us, is bringing those researchers directly to information security and to our infrastructure team so that we can have that conversation, sit down, understand what they need, and start building out those services in the cloud. But it's complex on the research side, much more so than the commodity.
I'll tell you what, I'm collecting stories from people, especially ones of failure. In the research space, it'd be handy because then I can detune them to help it be illustrative for other researchers. I know of a couple directly that I could point out where someone said they knew what they were doing, they didn't. They nearly got run over by a bus. And I want to make sure that those things can be, one, clarified and maybe de-identified, and all the guilty would be protected in a sense. But you know, if you have any of those, I put my contact information in there. Go ahead and send me a note. I'd like to collect them in confidence. Maybe repackage them in a way that would be helpful to the research community. You could call them sad stories.
All right.
Yeah, David's asking a good question.
Yep.
Yes, for research projects that span multiple universities, how do you think of security for that? Ooh, yes. That's one we have to deal with. We have multi-institution clinical trials we have to take care of, which that adds a whole nother layer once you add HIPAA on top of it.
Yeah, if you did the National Children's Study, you were there. I would say you do need to connect your CISOs or the research security people together and settle on the most common denominators. Because, you know, I would say we're the principal PI, but you got 4 PIs in different universities. You have different ways to solve it. I think it would be good to find one and follow that pattern.
Yeah, I agree with Tom here. I mean, there just has to be conversation, probably not only between the CISOs, but the lawyers and various other folks at those universities to get something ironed out there that they all agree upon. I don't know there's any magic recipe to that particular bit of sausage making, besides to say, you know, high up, you know, the higher the support you can get for the particular project, the better off you are to encourage those discussions and encourage them to come to a productive conclusion.
Ooh, I like the comment that Scott made. Health sector researchers each individually have a different understanding about data security. And part of that is the way HIPAA is defined. So, for example, Michigan Medicine tends to be one of the more conservative institutions around HIPAA. So a lot of the controls that are technically recommended, Michigan requires them, which that will create hiccups if you have a mismatch between institutions in a trial.
There's a comment by Lydia higher up a little bit about the standardized ARM models for research, and absolutely, there are no real solid ones out there, but I think there's an opportunity, and there's some groups that have been working on some of these risk models, similar to what EDUCAUSE did with the HACVET for the vendor assessments. I look forward to seeing similar products out of the community that can ease the burden on all of the institutions.
You know, I'll jump in on hopping back to Scott's point for a second, I think this is a place where security and research facilitation are very aligned, is we would both like to see more common usage of the centralized research services at our institutions. We do it because, exactly as Scott said, we'd much rather be interfacing with the HPC and the research infrastructure admins than a whole bunch of servers under desks. And
yeah, and I'd go back for that to what Saul said, by making that freely available to people, making it faster, better, easier to use than putting it under their desk is the key to that. So if we can get our institutions to support these centralized resources that just make it too easy, they don't want to put it anywhere else because the central systems are the easiest for them to use, but cost can't be a barrier to that.
I think, again, I implore the research computing audience members to disambiguate for research and university leadership that high performance computing or advanced computing systems are some sort of esoteric magic that is only for a certain number of researchers these days. It's for everybody. And when it becomes for everybody, it should be better supported, better funneled centrally, better consolidated, in the same way that we did in probably all of our institutions around commodity systems like ERPs. It's getting to that level. Now I know there's complexities in that, especially that our research community will bring up. You don't have just the right type of core, you don't have the right number, whatever it is, but we're getting closer to that space. And, again, have a voice. It doesn't have to always be this way. Or at least we should try not to have it be this way. And then I think we're both serving our communities well.
Mhm. There's actually an interesting paper in PERC this year regarding that. It was from Purdue. Anybody from Purdue here by any chance? They managed to show with some financial models I don't understand that all researchers, even the ones who don't use HPC, benefit from the HPC Center.
I'm here if you need one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to, but I think that might have been something Preston was putting out. I know he was doing a lot of analysis on trying to measure the effect of supporting some of these kind of products and services, but specifically put it into terms that maybe are a little more financial, that might be understood by CFOs and things like that. But also we've been looking a lot at what are the other benefits, and can we articulate those in terms of publications and degrees and these sorts of things, and how do you when you have a conversation with upper university management, you have to try and explain what's the cost benefit. You have to make a good case for the benefits. Otherwise, you're just a cost center. So.
If you could share that, Kevin, that would be hugely appreciated, because a lot of the times they could just get stumped on IT. Hey, IT solved this problem. Well, IT doesn't necessarily have the expertise to really get this off the ground and to the level that the researchers will need across the board. So thank you for that.
Yep, I found the link for the paper and I put it in chat. This is a really good paper.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why there's the segregation a lot of times between enterprise IT and research IT also, because the research computing departments like that are represented here do have that experience. And we also have the research facilitators, which should be part of that cost of providing these services. Again, like Katrina, you said, for cloud, the research facilitators understand the research needs and they can understand the computing needs to tie them to local and also to cloud, but those people need to be provided as part of these tools. They're the front end and they're the people that help use them. So that's, going back again to Saul, and if we can all just make sure that people understand this is kind of like email. Nobody would be running email without people to run email. I mean, you know, it's a central system that needs that kind of support, needs people to help.
Yeah, and one of my favorite quotes from the paper, or at least the presentation, is around language. We should stop calling these subsidies. They're the cost of doing business. We don't call the costs for running SAP a subsidy.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about, you know, how much you have to subsidize systems to get them to a competitive level for a buy-in program where researchers are buying in. And it's like, well, you know, you're kind of approaching it from the wrong perspective. You wouldn't say, hey, researcher, would you like to have email? Well, there's a subsidy. We'll subsidize, you know, the first half of the cost of your email, and then you have to, you know, like, that's just an absurd conversation.
It's true.
Cool. I saw a really long question from Matthew. Matthew, could you just ask it?
Yeah, it's long-winded, and you've already touched upon this, but I'll rephrase the entire question. You have accepted a job as a new CISO of a R1 institution and been airdropped in there. You realize that there are countless research divisions that have a legacy of 20 plus years that have been doing their own thing with minimal oversight in terms of security. There are policies that are published about what you have to adhere to in terms of security standards and whatnot, but you don't have visibility or auditing. How do you get everyone to the table? How do you get people talking, especially when showing everyone your cards puts you under excessive scrutiny and would actually interfere with their research?
So this is not the CISO's job, frankly, unless there is no CIO, VP for IT, or anybody else that sort of centrally runs the IT shop. It can't just be do the security, here's the rules. So it should be done in partnership with, you know, leadership that wants it done. There's ways, I don't want to call them underhanded or Machiavellian, but if there are ways to poke at this. You mentioned audit. Most universities have an audit. If you wanted to create enemies fast, you'd stick audit on these groups. But I think the way you need to start is, well, this is a security problem. It's also an IT problem. So start with that as the beginning. And you can make all sorts of cases for why, whether you want to call it centralization, consolidation, rationalization, is a good idea. The more you're pulling out storage, authentication and access systems into one central place, the better they're supported, the better things will move efficiently and can work efficiently at the university as a whole. But picking fights with 20 people as you're parachuted in as a CISO is a losing proposition.
It's a research problem too. Our Office of Research actually did a third-party assessment focused on some of the high-risk areas for us. It's a College of Engineering, for instance, College of Medicine, are the two ones that have security clauses in a lot of their contracts. So the third-party assessment came in and laid out some of these basic gaps within that college. So then they came back to security and central IT and said, hey, how do we solve this problem? And College of Engineering for us became an incredible advocate, because they realize this impacts the amount of money they're going to be able to get. They're the ones that are going to have to provide the documentation for all of these individual projects, because they managed a lot of their systems separately. So all of a sudden, they realized, hey, we can't do this on our own. Security, come help us. And it's been an incredible experience for us, because we are learning what they need. They're learning how we handle things, and they're partnering with us on standards. We're writing a lot of them together. They review them before we implement them in other units.
I'll just pick up on what Saul and Katrina said there and say, you know, one thing I think you learn in managing and leading cybersecurity early on is you've got to be opportunistic, right? And look for your moments to jump in and help or educate or otherwise, you know, make a point. You know, there's more research across campus that I'm going to get to in my career. So finding the high priority stuff, looking for the moments to jump in there and help with them in particular is just got to be, I think, part of any cybersecurity leader's game plan on this front. And
I'd say, Matthew, have them go read that Trusted CI report. Tell your researchers, don't be those guys. And to know, because in a sense, you're educating them. And that's all you have to do, educate them and then help them make decisions. And then ideally, you also get a better understanding of what their 20 years of stuff happened. I mean, they could be using Eudora and you don't know. But another thing is, as you're upgrading your infrastructure, you tend to break old things. There's an old movie called Dune. I don't know, show of hands, anybody who's read the books by Frank Herbert? Well, one of the things where they had the spice plan, it says, if you can destroy the spice, you can control the spice. Well, sometimes the central IT organization can turn off the network or turn it back on. You don't necessarily have to hold them over that over people's heads, but you do need to point out that your job is to provide a clean pipe for that to happen, and then see where they fit into that schema. And wear a still suit if you have one.
And
Thank
don't
you,
shame
everyone.
your partners. That's the other thing is it's sometimes in security and IT, it's like, oh, you haven't done this in 20 years. I can't believe your infrastructure is so aged. You haven't considered the security controls. That does not help. Yes, it's a problem. It's a gap. How do we focus on fixing it and helping you move forward instead of rehashing who screwed this up 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's kind of like the no blame postmortem. Although I did run into a PCI problem where I had to stand on somebody's desk and they said, I've been doing this for 10 years. Like, I'm a regular lawbreaker, we call it.
Cool. Well, we have 1 minute left. Any final thoughts from anybody?
I saw Saul waving his hand. Did you have something, Saul?
I was just agreeing to not shaming partners.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Yes.
All right. Well, everyone, let's thank our panelists for a very wonderful discussion. Great to see you all. Reminder that there is still the systems facing tomorrow to talk about PERC and thoughts from that. And thank you to all our panelists. This was wonderful. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for making time in your days, everybody. Have a great day.
And we'll
Thank you,
send
Doug.
out a link to the recording to everybody. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and a link to the document where we've been taking notes furiously and hoping to catch everything. So please let us know if anybody needs anything else. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks for the invitation.